Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 37 in the podcast series. Today is all about knitting for the finish line, and I have a finished object that was finished before a deadline. I have a work in progress that is a test knit that is on a deadline, and I have some other reviews and knit together project info and all kinds of good stuff today. So thanks for joining me. It's nice to see you if you're a returning viewer. As always, I enjoy so much our conversations and communications. And if you're new, welcome very much. This is a podcast about knitting and spinning, mostly about garment construction, and trying new things and learning new things. So you're very welcome here, and it's nice to see you. Let's see. So let's jump right in with the test knit. I have my finished object segment in a moment. I had to record it earlier because the finished object I have for you this week is the Foundry Scarf by Jared Flood of Brooklyn Tweed. And it was a sample knit for Wool and Honey up in Michigan. And when I finished that ahead of schedule, I also photographed it and did a quick podcast segment about it, and then put it right in the box and shipped it out because I wanted nothing to happen to it before it made its way back to Melissa and Liz of Wool and Honey. So that segment will be a kind of like back in time segment, and we'll get to that in just a minute. This beauty beside me is the test knit I'm doing for Albina of LB Handknits, and you've heard about Albina and LB Handknits on this podcast before. I did another test knit for her very recently, and she is a really cool up-and-coming designer who's been doing a lot of new designs and a lot of great work. This particular design is linked to the Woolen Festival, which is happening in Dublin this next weekend. I think it's May 25th, 26th, 27th, something like that. And it's the first run of that festival, and so this is one of the patterns that's being made exclusively for that festival, and it will be released on May 25th, so the end of next week. Super exciting. So when Albina wrote to me, I was about this test knit, I was in the middle of the sample knit for Wool and Honey, and she said, just thought I'd check with you, like, you don't happen to have time to, knit up a fingering weight sweater and do a little test knit for me, do you? I said, oh, Albina, for you, anything. And I was also really close to finishing that sample knit, so I wasn't too worried about it. And this is the result. So let me tell you a little bit about the pattern, and I'm going to pull it up on the computer so that you can see what it looks like. The pattern's called Scale Gras, which is, in Irish it means love story, and it was designed for Townhouse Yarns, and so the original that I'm going to show you in a minute was knit in Townhouse Yarns, and they're another indie dyer in Dublin in Ireland, and I did a whole podcast on all things Irish and a lot of indie dyers and designers and yarn makers there, so if you want to check that out, I'll put a link in the show notes and on the screen here, at least which number podcast it was, so you can go back and check that out if you want to. So the original was knit in Townhouse Yarns, and it was knit in this new non-superwash base called Ola, and Albina has a great review of that base up on her website, so I'll put all that in the show notes. But it's a really cool yarn, and it came out beautifully. Let me show you the her version of it. Some of Albina's beautiful photographs of this. Yeah, I can do it this way. Okay. Let me show you some beautiful photographs. This is the sweater in these Townhouse yarns. And it's cool. Albina shows her sweaters on different models, often different size models, so that you can get a sense of what the size would look like based on different body types. It's a really just gorgeous lace yoked pullover. That gives you the best sense of the lace, right? Beautiful pattern, and that is going to be released, like I said, on May 25th. There's a placeholder page for it up on Ravelry, so you can go check out all the specs if you want to sort of start collecting your yarn ahead of time and get ready to knit this pattern once it comes out. As I said, it's a lace yoke pullover, knit from the top down seamlessly, which is kind of one of the things that Albina and LB Handknits is known for. It has some beautiful short rows in the back to kind of lift up the back as usual, And this lace pattern is really pretty easy to follow. It's charted and written out in the pattern, so either way, whatever kind of knitter you are, you'll be able to work that out. And I really wish it were blocked right now so that you could see, but you could see in the photos I showed you how much this lace is just going to open up and produce a kind of beautiful yoke. The rest of the sweater, depending on how you knit it, is she knits her version in a kind of A-line silhouette with a little bit of a flounce at the back for the hem, and I think you saw that in one of the photographs. It really is a nice kind of flowing design. I-cord edging everywhere to kind of do some nice finish work, and then the cuffs, which are 3/4 length sleeves, at the cuffs you see a kind of repeat of this lace pattern. Really classic design, really beautiful, easy to knit. And now I'm just at the stockinette portion. So I am acres of stockinette with a few short rows in the back all the way down. One thing I wanted to come back to about Albina sweaters, and I've talked about this before, but her design uses provisional cast on for the armpits. And in the last sweater I showed you the finished version of that and how neat it is in terms of stitches, because once you pick up these stitches are all live around the upper arm here, the sleeve cap, and then down here, the way that the pattern is written, Albina uses a provisional cast on for these stitches onto waste yarn. And what that does is it also creates a set of live stitches. So when you pick up all these live stitches, the armpit is just perfectly seamless. And I showed that to you in the finished sweater last time, but I wanted you to be able to see it in the in the open sleeve here. And I think you can see it pretty well. These stitches are all live on that waste yarn. It's a beautiful way to do an armpit. If armpits can be beautiful, I want to talk about beautiful armpits again. And when I am working out the rest of this sweater, the other thing I'd say is that I'm not going to do a full A-line because I don't think it would be quite as flattering to me. So Albina suggested that I knit a version that's more of a straight line down. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to go for the 3/4 length sleeves because I love that detail. And it's kind of a springy, summery type garment. And I think it'll be really beautiful with those. I love that 3/4 length sleeve. So wish me luck. I'm going to try to finish by Friday when the pattern's released so that my test knit project page up on Ravelry can help out the pattern and be there to support the wool festival that's going on in Ireland next weekend. So Albina, thanks for the opportunity with this test knit. It's gorgeous. I hope so many of you guys will go out there and check out the pattern page and check out the pattern once it comes out on May 25th. I have been storing, I will say, this sweater in this awesome bag, which is huge. And I usually don't talk too much about purchases on here, but this is a bag that I saw on Instagram from someone that I follow. This is Vicki of Bird Leg Bags, and I'm trying to pull some stuff out of it so you can see the inside. One of the things that sold me on this bag is the awesome inner pockets. So there are like 4 or 5 pockets sewn into this bag here. And so I've got my needle case in one, I've got my entire notions bag in another. There's room over here. I've got some of I keep my yarn info in there. It's a reinforced, it has this great canvas on the inside. So it's like super strong. You could totally flip this bag inside out and it would be just as strong. Beautiful fabric on the outside and a cool drawstring on the top. And it's a huge bag. It's awesome because I can fit all the yarn for the sweater in it, and the sweater, and all my notions, and my swatches, and my everything. And I really just think it's a cool bag. So I've been carrying it around in that, and that's Bird Leg Bags, and that's Vicki over on Etsy. Love her stuff. Just found her recently on Instagram, and it's been really fun. The other thing I'll mention is that while Albina knit her version in the Townhouse yarns, which are beautiful, and I'd love a chance to kind of get to work with them at some point, if I can ship them in from Ireland. I decided to use 2-ply from Green Mountain Spinnery, and many of you will probably be familiar with Green Mountain Spinnery. It's a pretty popular kind of US-based cooperative yarn company. And they produce a lot of different kinds of yarn. This is a sock art Lana, which is a 2-ply sock weight, 100% fine wool from the US, 400 yards for each skein, and it's in the colorway Dungarees. Just see if it'll show up here. So the yarn for the sweater looks like this, which is really quite beautiful. It's got a little tweediness to it. It has a nice hand. It's not the softest yarn in the world, but it's pretty darn soft, and I think it'll be really comfortable. It's a very lightweight yarn. It feels almost like it was woolen spun, even though it's worsted spun, but it's a 2-ply. I'm not a huge fan of 2-plies for everything, just like I'm not a huge fan of 3-plies or 1-plies for everything. I think they all have their place. So I often use singles for things like shawls and scarves. 2-plies are great for things with lace in them because they lay open. The 2-plies kind of don't roll against each other. They kind of settle in and allow the openings to open really nicely. So once this is washed and blocked, it'll, like, all the lacework will fall open really nicely and block out. Just like I've always talked about 3-plies and 4-plies being great for cables. So it just depends on what you're knitting as to which yarn is good for what. When I picked up this yarn at, where did I get this? I got this at the Wisconsin Sheep and Wool Festival this past year. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to knit with it. I knew I wanted to make a sweater out of it. And it was one of those purchases where I saw it, I loved it, and I bought a sweater's worth of it. And I'm so happy I did, because when Albina contacted me to do this kind of last minute test knit, I ran upstairs, looked through my sweater bin, and lo and behold, this yarn was in there, and it's really a perfect yarn for this project. So yeah, so that's the test knit. Let me switch you over to the past, and we'll talk a little bit about that sample knit that I showed you on the last episode. So my finished object for this week is a Foundry Scarf by Jared Flood of Brooklyn Tweed, and I knit this as a sample for Wool and Honey, which is a cool yarn shop up in Michigan. You should check them out. They have a great online presence, and soon their shop will have this scarf in it. So this is the Foundry Scarf, and I'll show you the photo on the pattern here. This sample here was knit in a beautiful kind of plum version of the yarn, and I knit mine in a colorway called Potion. The yarn is Arbor, which is a Brooklyn Tweed yarn. And Arbor's cool because it's sourced in Montana and South Dakota and spun in Springvale, Maine. So it's a US sourced and spun yarn, and it's all Targhee wool, and Targhee wool has an amazing kind of spring to it. So I'll show you this here. This is the Potion colorway. This is all I have left. I used about 7 skeins, 6.5 skeins. This was the leftovers. But you can see Targhee, whenever I've worked with it, it's really quite amazing. Let's see if we can get this to go on the camera. I think that, there you go. You can see just how springy it is. And it has a great kind of elasticity and a great memory to it. I knit an entire sweater out of 100% Targhee wool, and I'm looking up here because it's up on my shelf. It ended up being more drapey than I expected it to be, so that's one thing I was curious about, how this Targhee would be compared to that Targhee. And this Targhee, because I think partially of all of the cables, is a little bit more stabilized, though it really is quite drapey, as you can see, even with all the structure of the cables still involved. So I think of Targhee as a very, it's elastic, it has some memory, but it's also fairly drapey kind of yarn. And this Arbor from Brooklyn Tweed is a little bit expensive. I think it's around $13 or $14 a skein if you were to buy it. And I'm actually supposed to use Arbor for the Geiger sweater by Nora Gahn that I have in my queue to knit. So I'll keep updating you on what I'm thinking about this Targhee wool as I knit more and more things with it. One of the cool things about this yarn is that it is a 3-ply. Yes, it is a 3-ply. And as a 3-ply, as with most 3-plies or 4-plies, it's perfect for cables because it's very plump. You can see the kind of roundness of the fiber, or the yarn. And what that means is that the three pieces of yarn that are together in the 3-ply create a rounder yarn, so there's less gaps for the yarn to kind of fall into, and so when you pile one on top of another, they really sit nicely, and you can see that the cable definition in this is pretty cool. I'll show it up front here. There you go. Oh, that's really nice. You can see it pretty well there. So it's an all over the front cable pattern for this scarf. This is what the front looks like. And I'll show you the back because the back is actually almost as beautiful as the front. This is what the reverse side of the fabric looks like. And I almost fancy the reverse side a little bit more than the cables, if that's possible. I think it's really quite beautiful. The pattern it is huge. It is, I think it's taller than me. So I can't even get it all on the camera here. It's like from bottom to top. It is a huge scarf. Very plump and plush and whatnot. So I'll show you if you were to kind of wrap yourself in it. You get this, I mean, it would be great for winter, right? If you were cold and you wanted to have something that kind of sat up around your face, it's really quite perfect for that. It's also just it's like a very Jared Flood kind of pattern. It's very fashionable. You could wear it in all kinds of different ways. It has a button band on one side, and on the other side you can see the buttonholes I've put in here, which means that you could wrap it and kind of button it up in a way, and that's kind of how she has it in the photograph of the sample there. Kind of, you can see the buttons. Now, the good folks, Melissa and Liz of Wool and Honey, are going to add buttons to this scarf once it arrives in their shop. And they said they just didn't have quite the right buttons when they sent me the yarn and the pattern originally, so they're going to add them later. But they'll go right down here on this button band, which is a nice couple of inches at the bottom here. So a couple other things about this pattern I will note for you. It is a serious cable pattern, not because it's difficult to follow the pattern. You get into a kind of rhythm with it. It's pretty simple 2x1 cabling right and left. And I did it all with a cable needle. I didn't want to mess with kind of cabling without a cable needle for this one. The fabric it produces is a pretty cool fabric, but I would note that if you're into cables, great. A lot of us who are into cables like to have rest rows, and this does have rest rows kind of on the back, where you're mostly just knitting and purling in pattern, but not always. So it's not exactly a totally relaxing, mindless knit. And then on the front side, on the right side of the pattern, you're always cabling. So every other row you are cabling. And if that is something that appeals to you, awesome. If it's if it's something where you're used to cabling and you have like a cable every 5th row, every 4th row, every 6th row, something like that, this is a different kind of cabling in that it is every other row. Always on the right side, always cabling. It's a very massive scarf. I ended up, to get dimensions, his pattern is, I think it's supposed to be 10.5 inches across this way, and it's supposed to be about 63 inches long. To get gauge for this pattern, I had to go down 3 needle sizes. Now, I'm a tight knitter, and usually I'm having to adjust the other way. But from what I've heard, I was reading some other project pages. Jared Flood's patterns are kind of known for being having gauge kind of issues for a lot of people. So this pattern recommends a size 7 needle for the main fabric. I ended up with a size 4. And because there are 2 other needles that you need to use for the tubular cast on down here at the bottom, which I absolutely love and think is really, really cool. And I don't know if the camera will pick up it. There it is. The tubular cast on is really beautiful, finished, lovely. But in order to do the tubular cast on and then this lower ribbing, you need 2 other needles that are smaller. The pattern recommends, like I said, a size 7 for the main fabric and a size 5 and 4 for the ribbing and the tubular cast on. I ended up using, like I said, a size 4 for the main fabric and a size 2 for the ribbing, and the 2 being 2.75 millimeters, and the tubular cast on I did 2.25 millimeters. So that was a ratio based on the ratio of his original needles to produce the same kind of effect between the cast on, the ribbing, and then up into the cables. Big needle change, and I will say that working with this yarn, which is a DK weight yarn with size 4 needles, is not always friendly on the hands. I was constantly kind of doing a little bit of hand exercises more than I usually do to kind of break the stiffness, because knitting with smaller needles with a larger weight yarn can produce a little bit of hand issues if you're not careful. I also knit up a swatch of this, a big portion of it, in the size 7, the original size 7, 5, and 4 needles, just to see what it would look like. And the fabric that you get is much bigger than this. This is almost gauge. It measured, it's about, I think it ended up being 11 inches across instead of 10 and a half. When I used the size 7 needles, it was about 14 or 15 inches across. I think that's fine, and had I not been doing a sample knit for Wool and Honey where they were asking for gauge, I might have just gone with it because it produced a different kind of fabric. It was a little more open, a little softer, a little plusher, because, you know, this is a DK weight yarn and knitting with size 7 needles kind of makes sense. I'm pretty happy with the way this fabric turned out in the end, but there's just a difference in taste if you're going for gauge or if you're going for kind of different kind of fabric. This is still really soft and plush and comfortable on the body and against the skin. So that's most of my notes about the actual pattern, and I have a Ravelry project page set up where I've noted a bunch of these things and the needle sizes, etc., etc. If you're interested in checking that out, you can head over there and see all of my notes. So those are my notes about the pattern, and the last thing I wanted to kind of talk with you guys about a little bit is the fact that it was a sample knit. In the last podcast, I talked a little bit about test knitting and sample knitting, the differences between them, how to become a test knitter or sample knitter, and we opened up the Ravelry thread in the group so that if you have experiences you want to share or you're looking for tests or sample knitters in the group, that would be a great place to go. So there's been some chatter going on over there, and it's really neat to see folks talking to each other. And we do have some designers in the group, so there's some really interesting conversations going on over there. So my experience with sample knitting was that it changed knitting a little bit for me. I'm a process knitter, so I really enjoy, you know, the actual process of making something. Whether or not I keep it or give it away matters less to me. And it's definitely not that I became more attached to this as I did it. I do think it's beautiful, and I'm very proud of it, and I'm glad to send it off to Melissa and Liz of Wool and Honey. But the sample knitting I found to be a little bit more stressful than normal knitting, in part because I knew that this finished object was going back to someone who needed to use it for something specific and had certain kinds of expectations about it. And maybe that's, I was thinking, maybe that's partially like why I became a professor, or why I enjoyed school so much. I don't know, just figuring out what it is that my teachers wanted, what the expectations were and how I could meet them. Maybe that's it, but I felt kind of similarly about this. Like, there were expectations, I really wanted to meet them. I really want Melissa and Liz to get this object into their shop and think to themselves, wow, this is well done, you know, professionally and thoughtfully. And so it changes knitting just a little bit, because as I'm knitting, I'm much more concerned than I would normally be about the small mistakes. You know, like if there's a missed, if one of these purls were to become a knit stitch, which happened throughout the process, you know, every once in a while you'd miss something. And I would make sure, much more than in my own knitting, to drop back down and fix that stitch. I found a tiny mistake on the selve edge at one point, and I dropped down about 25 rows to fix the mistake. So just those little kinds of things, and kind of wondering if, you know, I knew I was at gauge, but just wondering how it would actually wash out, and would it look the same? Would it look right? Would it be a kind of really cool finished object? So all those different things really did change the knitting process for me as I was working on this particular object. I'm not sure. I'm curious if I will sample knit again. It wasn't the deadline because I finished this in about 2 weeks, and I think I had a month to finish it. But I think I like test knitting a little bit more at this point in my knitting career, but I really do, I did enjoy the process of sample knitting as a process. And I've told Spencer, my husband, throughout the last 6 or 7 years that I've been knitting and spinning and dyeing and everything else, just that part of my fascination with this is just learning something new and trying everything. So, you know, I've settled on a few things. I tried color work and I can do it, but I don't like it as much as I like cables and lace. So there's one decision kind of made. I can dye and I like dyeing, but it's not something I want to do full time. similarly with sample and test knitting, I enjoyed the kind of process and going through this and thinking about the psychology of it and the object and what it was like and all that kind of stuff. But I think I enjoyed test knitting a little bit more if I had to choose between the two. And I do think that this pattern, of all patterns to start with, was a little bit tricky because it is a somewhat repetitive, if I can say that kindly, pattern that does demand the kind of cabling on every other row. So I'm coming from a place where I'm doing a lot of garment construction. I'm doing a lot of, in my own knitting, a lot of garment construction that requires a lot of math and thinking, and you change all the time because you're working on the yoke, or you're working on the hem, or you're working on the sleeve. It's all different. Whereas this is pretty much like you're working on this and it's like 25 repeats of the same thing over and over again. So I think if I were to take on another sample knit, I would really like it to be a garment, because I enjoy knitting those a little bit more, and that's something that I have discovered all along as well. So success, I think, with sample knitting, and I'm going to send this off to Melissa and Liz on Monday, and I'm very happy with it, and I hope they are too. And I think I might do some more sample knitting if I can get some garment work, and that's where I'm at. Okay, so that was Foundry, the cabled scarf from Jared Flood, and I'll show it to you one more time in case you're interested. Knit out of the Arbor Brooklyn tweed yarn, and it's off to Wool and Honey. Melissa and Liz, I hope you enjoy it in your shop. So I hope you guys enjoyed that little blast from the past about the sample knit for Wool and Honey. And the last segment of the podcast is about the Knit Together project and a brief review for you. So the Knit Together project, for those of you who don't know, has been an ongoing project that we've been working on since last summer, I believe, is when it started. And you can check out the details about it on the blog. I'm still accepting squares for the blanket, which is a collaborative blanket where everyone's sending in squares with yarn or patterns that they have a story that they really care about in one way or another, and the result is going to be a massive community blanket that someone will win. If you send in a square, you're entered to win the finished project. And I said I'm still accepting squares, but I'm going to have to put a deadline on it, I think, at this point, because we've gone a year, which is what we were kind of hoping for. I have a huge box full of squares, and I'm ready to get knitting on that blanket this summer and get it together. So if you're thinking of sending in a square, let's say the final deadline will be August 1st. So I'll put that up in the blog and add that to the Ravelry group. But if you're interested in getting involved, please send squares to me by August 1st. So this week I have a square from Agnes, and it's a really cool, it looks like intarsia, but it's actually double knit over the top here. And I can show you the back in just a minute. So Agnes is of the Ready to Knit. She doesn't do a podcast so much as she does a blog, which is a really great blog. And I follow her on Instagram and follow her blog. She posted the story of this square up on her blog, so I'm going to direct you over there to hear the full story. But what I will tell you is what she said in her little card and a little bit from her blog. So Agnes is coming, well, her square came from France, and it's actually, it was the end of the line for some of the DPNs that went overseas. So she said, "It seems the tag gene is stopping with me for now. The project and the DPNs have crossed the Atlantic, and I'm sending them back to you along with my square. Feel free to read the story behind it at readytoknit.com. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but I'm a terrible procrastinator. Finally finished the square and sent it to you. Best for your future in the project." So this square, she said, was inspired by the Ophelia storm, which, and I'll just read what she said on the blog just very briefly. She said, "The heavy winds brought sands from the Sahara Desert with the smoke rising from the wildfires in Portugal. This was last fall. It created an eerie atmosphere over France and England. The sky became yellow and the sun turned red. It was really surreal. So this yellow cloud is a sand-filled cloud dropping sand particles over a stormy sky." I think that's so cool. And the yarn is special too. The yarn came from Stonehenge and from Shirley, which is, Shirley is great blogger over at Handmade Habit. So there's been a kind of little community connection there, getting the yarn from one person to the other. So thank you, Agnes, for this wonderful square. It's gonna go right into the blanket. And for anyone else who wants to send an 8x8 square, please do so by August 1st. I can't wait to start talking about this sewing up of the final blanket and getting it out to one of you who has submitted a square during this whole Knit Together project. So the last thing I want to talk to you guys about are KnitCrate subscriptions, and KnitCrate looks a lot like this when it comes in the mail. And KnitCrate kind of got in touch with me, 3 or 4 months ago now, and asked if I'd be interested in reviewing some of their crates. So I said, sure, no problem. I put one up on the blog back for the March and maybe the April artisan boxes, and since then they've also sent me some sock boxes, and I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that I'm going to post a full review over on the blog about these different boxes, but I thought I'd show them to you now anyway. So for the May box, the theme is contemporary across the board, and in the sock yarn crate you get this contemporary membership card, a really great pattern for some cool socks, and this yarn, which is the KnitCrate's own yarn. And I think this sock yarn is really quite beautiful. It's got some speckles in it. And like I said, this is the KnitCrate's own like in-house yarn. This one is, the colorway is Weekend, and it's a luxury sock. So it's superwash merino, 10% cashmere and nylon, and it's 439 yards. It's a really, like I said, I really like those funky speckles, and I think it would make a beautiful sock pattern, or a shawl actually, either way. And the other May box that is the contemporary box is the Artisan Crate, and let me show you this guy. This is the contemporary for the Artisan Crate option. They have about 4 different options if you're interested. And this yarn came this is tree wool, which I think is some beautiful colors here. This is some 70% superwash, or no, not superwash. This is 70% super fine merino and 30% tencel. And it is machine washable. It's tree wool, and it's quite gorgeous. 2 skeins of it in the Artisan box, along with this. They always send 2 different patterns. So there's this pattern. Usually they send a beginner and a kind of intermediate pattern. So this is the beginner pattern, which is a lovely shawl. I'll show you more in a moment. And the intermediate pattern is a set of mitts and a hat, which is pretty cool. Let me show you a quick close-up of the that shawl pattern, because it really, the variegated yarn, I think it shows off variegated yarn really well. It's quite a beautiful little wrap there. So that's the most recent KnitCrate subscription boxes in the sock and the Artisan Crate. And I will put some links in the show notes if you're interested in picking up one of those crates, and I will direct you over to the blog where I'm going to post a more detailed review of the boxes that I've received so far. So I think that might be it for today. It's always lovely to see you guys and spend some time up here in the yarn room, hanging out, and actually looking out the window where there's a lot of really beautiful light today. So I will see you guys next time, and in the meantime I hope you have a lot of fun knitting up your projects and hanging out in Ravelry and building up this cool yarn community that we have. I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.